This morning, the lesson this morning is about expressing kindness. And Jesus showed us kindness, and I think those are the ways we need to learn to show kindness today, is the ways that Jesus showed kindness. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul considers the most excellent way to live is by the way of love. And in verse 3, or the first 3 verses of chapter 13, Paul said that love is more important than spiritual gifts, or more important than knowledge, or faith, or generosity, or even a willingness to die for Christ. For if we had all that, but we did not have love, they would be as empty and useless as a beating gong outside a pagan temple. And going on to verse 4, Paul tells us that love is patient, that love has a long fuse, love is slow to boil, and love counts down before it blasts off. And then he tells us that love is kind. And that is what I want us to consider this morning. Love is kind. If you were describing our world today, would you describe it as a kind world? As we look at the things going on in our world today, we would probably answer no, wouldn't we? Now, I see a lot of kindness in our community, in our small communities. You see kindness everywhere. But in our world today, we know that there's not kindness going on in very much at all. I heard a story about a woman who was standing at the bus stop, and she had just cashed her tax refund check. So she was carrying more money than usual and was a little bit nervous about it. And so she glanced around and noticed a shabbily dressed man standing nearby. And as she watched, she saw a man walk up to him and hand him some money, and he whispered something in his ear. So this woman was so touched by the act of kindness that she decided to do the same thing. So in a burst of generosity, she reached into her purse and she took out a $10 bill and handed it to the man and whispered to him, "Never despair, never despair." Well, the next day, when she came back to the bus stop, there was that man again. But this time he walked up to her and handed her $110. Dumbfounded, she asked, "What's this?" And the man said, "You won, lady. Never despair paid 10 to 1. Well, I can't promise that every act of kindness will pay 10 to 1. And at times, kindness may cost us something, doesn't it? And it requires sacrifice on our part. So with that in mind, let's look at a couple of the clearest examples of kindness in the Bible today. They are found in Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 56. And in this passage, we see Jesus showing kindness to 2 people who are completely different. One is a man, and the other is a woman. One is an outcast who is poor and unknown, and the other is a rich and influential and the ruler of a synagogue. And yet Jesus treats them both with great kindness. By the time of this story, Jesus had gained a great deal of fame and was at the pinnacle of his popularity. And people respected him as a healer and a teacher, and crowds were swarming around him wherever he went. But despite the pressures of popularity, and despite the crowds of constantly pushing in around him, and despite all the demands on him and his time, Jesus in his kindness stopped everything he was doing to help and to meet the people's needs. Cal Thomas once wrote, "Love talked about is easily ignored, but love demonstrated is irresistible." And Jesus not only talked about love and kindness, but he modeled it for us too. So let's look at and see the ways Jesus showed kindness to them, because I think those are the ways that we need to learn to show kindness today. First of all, Jesus expressed kindness by listening to people and by paying attention to their needs. Listen to Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 42. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a ruler of a synagogue, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of 12, was dying. And Jesus was on his way. The crowds almost crushed him. Now, we're not told where Jesus was going. Probably he was on his way to some open place where he could teach and preach to the crowds surrounding him. And that was something that was very important to do. But as soon as this man, Jairus, came and told him about his daughter, the very next words we read are, "As Jesus was on his way." Now, evidently, Jesus immediately changed directions and started following Jairus because this little girl's situation was much more pressing than whatever else he had scheduled. By the way, how well do we handle interruptions? Some people work best when they can concentrate on one thing and see it through to completion. They do not normally do 2 or 3 things well at the same time. So if they are concentrating and someone interrupts them, they consider that an intrusion, and they do not normally handle interruptions very well. I know I'm not that way, and maybe some of you aren't either. But as you get older, you learn that sometimes interruptions are sent by God, opportunities to minister that you would miss if you ignored them. If you just go on with your project and don't allow yourself to be interrupted, if you aren't flexible enough to change directions and go another way, you will miss great opportunities that God may place before you. Jesus paid attention to Jairus and changed his plans and his direction. But Jairus was not the only interruption. And Jesus was flexible and kind enough to pause and meet another need as they were on their way to Jairus' house. Listen to verse 43 through 46. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" And when they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that the power has gone out from me." There were crowds of people surrounding them, and everyone was in a hurry. Yet Jesus was able to differentiate between the touch of the crowd and the personal touch of the woman who needed his help. Our world today is becoming more and more impersonal, isn't it? You go to the gasoline station, and you don't even have to talk to anybody anymore there. Just put your card in the slot, pump the gas, and you can drive away without ever looking at another human being. And it's at the same way at the bank too, isn't it? How about the airlines? In any major city, call and you'll hear a computerized voice. If you want information regarding departing flights, you press 1. For arriving flights, press 2. You press 1 and it says, if you don't know your flight number, press 1. And you press 1 again and it says, enter your flight number. You punch that in and the computerized voice then tells you the correct gate number. You never have to talk to another living, breathing human being. It's become a very impersonal world, hasn't it? Can you imagine what would happen if they did this to 911? What if you dialed 911 and you hear, if your emergency is a murder, press 1. If it's a burglary, press 2. If the burglar is still in the house, press 3. And if he has a gun, press 4 really fast. I don't know what we're coming to. It has become a very impersonal world. But Jesus took time to stop in the midst of a crowd to give a woman his personal attention as though she was the only one there. The second thing is Jesus expressed kindness by being considerate to others. Verses 47 through 48 tell us, then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. And then he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. We need to realize that because of this woman's disease, she was considered unclean and therefore was an outcast. They treated her like they treated someone with leprosy. So because of that, she had not been living with her family for 12 years. Her self-esteem must have been as low as it could possibly be. So Jesus surprises her. First of all, by stopping and listening to her story of woe. I think we have a very condensed version of the story that she told. I mean, this is probably the first time that in a long time that she really had anyone's attention. So I imagine that she poured out her heart to him, and Jesus listened. And by listening, looking at her, by paying attention to her, he was displaying real kindness. So, are you a good listener? Sometimes we probably aren't. We pass each other and say, how are you? And we expect an automatic, I'm fine. But have you ever been caught off guard and someone really told you just how they feel? A friend of mine recalls that he once said, "How are you?" to a lady, and the lady replied, "You don't want to know." And he says she was right. I really didn't have the time to listen to her just then. I was hurrying on to do something else. I think it is true. Most of us really don't take the time to listen. Irma Bombeck told about a time when she was so tired of listening, she had listened to her son tell in minute detail about a movie he had just seen, punctuated by at least 100 you knows and okays. Then she had received several phone calls filled with what she felt was mindless chatter that never seemed to end. So it was with genuine relief that she was able to tell the last caller that she had just had to rush off to the airport. So she got into the taxi cab, and as the taxi cab driver took her to the airport, he told her all about his son who had won a scholarship to college and how he was making straight A's. And Irma had to sit there and listen to all that. She said, "But once I got to the airport and realized that I was 30 minutes early, I breathed a sigh of relief and thought, I had 30 minutes when I don't have to listen to anybody. I can just sit here and read my book and not be bothered at all." But no sooner than had she opened her book when an elderly female said to me, "I bet it's cold in Chicago." Irma Bombeck replies, "I suppose," without even looking up from her book. "I haven't been in Chicago for 3 years," the woman said, "and my son lives there." Irma said, "That's nice." Then the woman continued on, "My husband's body is on this plane. We were married for 53 years. I don't drive, you see, and the funeral director was so nice, he drove me to the airport today." Irma recalls her voice droned on. Here was a woman who didn't want money or advice or counsel. All she wanted was someone to listen. And in desperation, she had turned to a total stranger with her story. Irma Bombeck said she continued to talk to me until they announced that they were boarding the plane. We walked on to the plane, and I saw her sit down in another section. And as I hung up my coat, I heard her say to the person next to her, "I bet it's cold in Chicago." There are so many of us who just need somebody, some time to listen, just to focus on us and listen to what we have to say. And Jesus did so that day. The third thing that Jesus expresses kindness is through an understanding spirit. Notice what it says in verse 49 through 56. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. They said, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. Jesus said, "Stop wailing. She is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." And her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told him to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. Now let's concentrate on the last few verses. The miracle was exceptional, and we praise God for that. But notice what Jesus told them after the miracle was over. He said to them, "Do not tell anyone what happened." You know, some of the most disturbing words in the English language are 4 words that we like to speak, but we hate to hear. Those words are, "I told you so." It's fun to speak them, and we relish it when we're the ones saying it, "I told you so," but it's very difficult to listen to them, isn't it? Now remember, those people outside the house were mocking Jesus. They had laughed at him before he went to raise the girl back to life again. And if I were Jesus, I know that what I would have done. I would have raised the girl back to life, and then I would have taken her by the hand, and we would have walked up and down in front of all those people that had mocked Jesus and were laughing at him. And I would have said, "I told you so." That would have been a lot of fun, wouldn't it? But Jesus didn't do that. He was concerned about how they felt too. He didn't try to get even with them. He didn't try to get back at them. He didn't try to glorify himself. Instead, in kindness, he tells the parents, "Don't tell anyone what has happened here." Sometimes it's not so much what you say as how you say it. One preacher said, "I have never had to apologize for my position, but oftentimes I've had to apologize for my disposition." So have you ever had to apologize for your disposition? I like the story about the 6'10" cowboy who walked up to the counter at McDonald's. He slammed down his big fist and said to the girl behind the counter, "I want half a Big Mac." She said, "What?" He said, "I want half a Big Mac, and I want it now." Well, not sure what to do, she said, "Excuse me for a minute." And she headed over to her manager without realizing that the man was following her. She got to the manager and said, "There's a big klutz over there who's dumber than lead, and he has ordered half a Big Mac." About that time, she noticed and realized that he was standing right behind her. And quickly she added, "And this gentleman wants the other half." Sometimes we may be put on the spot, and what you say is important. But how you say it can be even more important. The fact that Jesus didn't want to embarrass those who had been mocking him or get even with them speaks volumes and teaches us how to respond to others too. there was some construction workers who were building a high-rise across the street from a hospital. And as they were working on the third floor, they noticed a little girl standing in the third floor window in the hospital watching them work. And one day, they looked across and saw the little girl hold up a poster that said, "My name is Lisa. What is your name?" So the next day, the construction workers came back with some poster board and magic markers, and they all wrote their names down on that poster. My name is Bob. My name is Bill. My name is Harry. And then they asked, "How old are you?" Well, the next day, the little girl held up a sign that said, "I am 7 years old. How old are you?" Well, this went on for several days. But one day, they noticed Lisa wasn't at her usual place in the window. So at break time, one of the workers called the hospital and asked for a third floor nurse. And he asked if she could tell him anything about Lisa. And the nurse said that Lisa had taken a turn for the worse and now was in intensive care. So the workers pooled their money and bought some flowers and a card and wrote on a note and sent it to Lisa in intensive care. And several days had passed, and then another sign appeared in the window that Lisa had passed away, and thank you for caring. In conclusion to the lesson, love is kind. We need to learn to be kind to one another, even as God has been kind through Jesus Christ, and offered him as a sacrifice for our sins. We give you this opportunity to respond to his love this morning. And we do that by offering his invitation and by inviting you to come forward and join us, that we can pray for you if you need anything at all, or if you would like to become a Christian. We have a baptistry ready. If there's any need, please come as we stand and sing.